In the following tutorial, we're going to take a look at some of our other options for fills. We've just experimented with doing an alpha transparency on a fill. So let's create another rectangle maybe, just so we can have a nice clean one to go with. I almost always like the rectangle primitive tool. I think it's a really nice tool to use. And it's so flexible, which I really like. Now, you'll notice that I don't have any stroke settings right now, and that's because I didn't set that up in my preset. I can always add a stroke to my object afterwards. And I know that I'm using kind of the standard color picker, which is not really that exciting. But you'll notice that there's some other items there, and that's what I'm about to bring up. So I'm currently on fills, and if you can access the same information really from either the color box or the color options down here. So if I go to fills, you'll notice that right now I have an alpha set and I'm using a color, but you'll see that there's some different styles down here, such as gradients and some really fancy gradients as well. Let's click on the gradient and you'll see that we now have a black and white gradient applied to this. If you look over on our color panel, you'll see that information here changes as well. It now says that instead of solid, we have a linear gradient that's being applied. And you'll see at the bottom we have our two colors, our white and our black. And we can actually change these colors if we want. To change the colors, click on the color and then find a different color that you want to replace it with. Click on the other swatch and find the color that you want to replace there. If we want to add colors in between, you can move your mouse between the two and you'll see there's a plus. Just click, change the color as needed, and you'll have a new swatch. Then you can move that swatch around to change its position on that gradient. Now if you don't like that swatch, just click on it and drag it away. You can drag it up, I believe. Or drag it down. That'll work too. It can be sometimes a little picky, but it does work eventually. Alright, now with this gradient we have some other things that we can do. We can even apply transparency in this gradient, which is really quite cool. It's really neat what you can do with a little bit of transparent gradient in your objects. However, it does make rendering them a little bit more difficult. Now the other thing that you want to be aware of with gradients are things like overflow, so that you can make it a gradient just stop, or you can make it cycle in a couple different ways. So in order to demonstrate this though, we need to change our gradient. So let's go over to the gradient transform tool by finding the free transform tool and then going to gradient transform tool. And you'll see that we have the ability to now click on this gradient and actually rotate it or move the gradient as needed. Now I never did show the regular transform tool, so that would be a good thing to do as well. So just like we're transforming this gradient, we can actually transform entire objects, which is kind of cool too. And you can see how this particular gradient is cycling. If we change the overflow to that, you'll see it just goes from one color to the other and then stops. So it's really quite cool what you can do with gradients, and we'll be playing with that with the animation later. Now I should have pointed out the free transform tool. Anytime you have the free transform tool, you can select any object and transform it in a few different ways. You want to make sure that everything that you want to transform is selected, and then you can move the arrow, this little dot in the center, which will actually change the transform point, which means that it will rotate around that point or scale from that point. And if you're scaling, make sure that you do hold down the shift key when you want to constrain those. You can also skew, which is clicking on one of those edges. So there's what we can do with the free transform tool. And we'll be playing with this tool a great deal more when we have the right types of objects to do it with, like symbols. So look at how that gradient has some transparency. So go ahead and play around with some objects, giving some different types of fills, and we'll come back and we'll look at fills later when we start getting into bitmaps at a later date. And then go ahead and save your work and go on to the next tutorial.